Hey guys, I'm reviewing Alexia's portfolios today. She just asked for general feedback, so I'm probably going to be looking at just like the main page at a high level and then diving into a case study. Um, Overall, I think it's super clean, very easy to look at. I love the little blurb you have here, like applying your background in human computer interactions and marketing. I'm curious if you can leverage some of your recent projects to provide a little bit more specifics. I'm not sure. I'm not saying you should. It really depends on what you're trying to communicate, what you're trying to tell as your career story. So I was looking at the resume. I was looking at your resume, and I see that right now you work as a senior specialist on the onboarding product, and a lot of it is like research heavy. You've also managed a lot of like relationships. I see here you led a team of five, and I'm not sure what kind of product. Like this seems like this is like a mobile app for dating. This is like chiropractor. This is a B2C. Yeah, I don't know if there's any like specific direction you want to take that you want to highlight. Like for example, if someone did a lot of like SaaS, you can say, I'm a designer with a background in XYZ, and I specialize in SaaS or something like that. Yeah, I'm curious if you want to utilize some of like your research experience and some of your other experience. Um, Other than that, I think it's super clean. I like that you highlighted some of the like you chose what were some of the main things that you want to highlight, and you kept it consistent for each one, and then you gave a little blurb of like what the case study is and what the user can expect to read about once they click into the case study. So this portfolio is, I guess, a little bit different from the usual ones that I review, simply because the ones I review are mostly from like bootcamp graduates, such as where I was like only about a year ago. No real life experience except for like an IDP if you came out of Springboard. And so this your portfolio, you've already worked with a team. I see that in your um, case study, you worked with engineers and handing it off. So I think that is um, definitely something different than I've been reviewing. Let's dive into magnetic. I think overall it's very, again, like really clean. I love the visual hierarchy, the way you titled everything, um, the telling of the story in like a chronological order. I think it's just easy to follow. I love that you highlighted what you did versus what the other designers did versus what the clients gave you, and I think it creates a clear story of like how you contributed into the what you contributed to the project. I think that's really important. Something that I do hear a lot with the feedbacks about that is like knowing what you did versus what the other designers did helps the recruiter and the hiring manager understand like what your role was within the product. Overall, I think it was very easy to follow the progression of the product and every step that you guys took to get to the end point. Love the visual hierarchy, just the size, the bolding, the spacing of things. It's just easy to understand like the sections and what I'm about to read about. Like here, just like again, the size difference, the contrast between all of this. Super crispy clean. imagery and photos and visuals, I think, it goes a long way. Let's start with the small details because it's the easiest one to communicate. The first one is the overview being center aligned. Meanwhile, everything else is left aligned, and it is taking my brain on a trip. I think mainly because the thing about alignment is if the alignment is consistent throughout, it's just less distracting on the eye and just the overall just this overall experience of reading through it and looking at it versus if the alignment is like out in out. It's just like that much more distracting. I think that's really the only place where you had an alignment where I didn't. Mm, I guess you do go with your paragraph alignment. You do go in and out a lot. So this goes in, this is out, this goes out, and then this goes in. I'm curious how it would work, how it would look if you were to align this to the rest of the page. So if this is like your padding for your text, I wonder how it looks if everything is aligned to that leftmost. So just like this, like design is here, and then your high fidelity mockups will be aligned here. I'm curious. I mean, I get why this is wider because if you were to stick to this, smaller, this more narrow, it would look a little bit too cramped. It would actually be, yeah, it would look very cramped. Um, Same thing here. But then maybe you made this smaller because if you were to make it that wide, it would look too like stretched. So it does feel like it is intentional. I'm trying to form an opinion on whether this part bothers me or not, and I don't think it is. I think because it feels very intentional, it's not. Okay, I think I got what it is. I think the fact that some of these are more narrow versus like sections like this where it's more wide, I don't think it's necessarily bothering me because again I see the intention there. When there's an image, then this margin gets wide. I think what is um, bothering me is these little blurbs. So these little blurbs are wide and it's not following that same structure, right? There's no image to the right of them. So since it's just a like a sentence or two, I think it should use the same width as these guys. And then again, maybe not center aligning it. Right now it's center aligned, and I think once you make it smaller, it'll make the paragraph longer. And after like a sentence or two, center aligned gets very not very. It gets just a little bit more difficult to read and to scan through. So I'm curious to see how this would look like if it's using this smaller width but left aligned. But again, these are like, tiny little nitpick details that my brain just picked up and I'm just sharing. Whether you want to, take it or leave it, that is completely up to you. But really, the only thing that really gets me was this like overview dip right here. I think besides that, I don't have any other like tiny nitpicks. I think everything else is very clean, very well put together. Yeah, I think it's great. Okay. Okay, so let's move on to I guess the first one, which is making it more scannable. Making the portfolio scannable, in my opinion, is very important. It's kind of like I think about it as like an elevator pitch. like the point of the elevator pitch is you only have so many characters and words you can use, right, to give like the quickest summary of who you are. And the reason for that, and the reason it's called elevator pitch, is when you meet someone and you want to connect and you want to network with them in a professional manner, you can't start reading out like a paragraph of like who you are, what you do, why, where you're trying to go and your goals and stuff like that. You're trying to do it within like a sentence or two, or else you lose their interest, right? I view the portfolio not the same way, in a very similar way. So when a recruiter looks at our portfolio, they're the front line. If you don't grab the attention of a recruiter, you ain't grabbing the attention of a hiring manager, because the hiring manager simply just are not going to even see it, right? More likely than not, the recruiters are going to filter it out for them. Now, I've spoken to several recruiters, and sometimes they're looking at hundreds of portfolio for one role. And when it's like 4:50 p.m. is the end of the day and they're looking at their 50th, honestly, like as a human, their brain could only take so much. And if they have to read all of this in order to even understand the context of the case study, we are doing a disservice to ourselves by making it difficult for them, right? Chances are their brain is done. It's tapped out. They can no longer store any more information, and then seeing a big paragraph is pretty daunting. And then what happens? They skim through it, and they're like, okay, I don't really quite see what I want. I'm going to take a look at it tomorrow. And then you lose the interest. Versus if you make it scannable, meaning they don't need to read big paragraphs in order to follow the storytelling and the storyline of the story of your creation of product. You just have that much more chance for them to be interested enough to now dive in just a little bit more deeper and to see and just to, I guess, for lack of better way of saying it, to see if it's worth their time. Copy can't be avoided, right? That's the way we explain things. That's the way we explain how things work. But there is a way to make them scannable. There's a way to make them short, and there's a way to make them more just easier to read and more friendly to the recruiters. So here's an example of how we can utilize descriptive titles. What I mean by that is, let's say instead of kickoff, the title will be a very short summary of what's going on in the paragraph, so that the main idea is when a person is scanning through it, they don't have to read the paragraph to understand the main highlights of it, right? So here, I mean, there's this is gonna be a bad example, but because there's like a couple of things going on in here, but instead of kickoff, maybe it's understanding the mission, audience, and core interactions. With that more descriptive title, unless I want to read like specific like details and stuff, I don't have to read all of this to understand that, okay, this is about understanding, XYZ. Versus a kickoff could be, anything. It could just be like handoff of like presentation, decks and whatever, handoff of like design system. It could be anything. Versus if a more descriptive and more specific title pretty much sums up all of this. So that's an example. The next thing we can do is the more obvious one, is to reduce the copy, trying to take out filler words, take out things that are already implied, take out like duplicate information. So for example here, instead of stating like, while meeting with a client, we learned that Shorty had conducted competitor research, and Shorty did this, and Shorty did that, and Shorty compiled some sketches and explained. And the first part was to understand the mission. Maybe we can shorten this to like a sentence or two. So maybe the goal of the kickoff was to understand the app's mission, audience, and core interactions, period. The client handed off the conducted competitor research, the competitor research they conducted, and also handed off some preliminary sketches and color inspirations, period. So that probably would be like this long, right? 2 sentences, maybe max here. So now we reduced four lines into 2 lines. That's just like a quick example of reducing copy. So the idea is just reading, like dissecting every single blurb, every single paragraph, and really figuring out, well, one, defining like what are the main things you want to communicate? What is the goal of this particular section? And then trying to differentiate between what is really important and what is not as important. And if you were to include it, all it'll do is make it long and messy. And then once you kind of differentiate into two, then it'll be easy to figure out which ones to delete and then which ones to keep. And then also like looking through them to find any filler words or any things that like maybe instead of using 3 words you can find 1 word for it. It's things like that. So that is the more straightforward way to reduce copy. But again, it's not always possible, right? Maybe you're at a point where it is the most like optimized it could be. It's just still long. So another way to make it more scannable and to reduce the copy is to separate, right? Making sure that the structure and the separation of information is working. So for example, here, so this big blurb. So let's say we've already edited the first, couple of sentences and we have 2 lines. What I mean by separation of information is here you also mentioned that provided approximately 20 use cases, you brought that to 10, and these are the starting points of the design. Separating this from this whole section and then adding it to here. Because technically what you're talking about here, the 10 roots and, bringing it down to 10, it kind of goes hand in hand with this section. So then all you're left is 2 sentences. 2 very easy to read, skimmable sentence. And then down here, you'll say the client provided 20 roots and we reduce it to 10. And then, a little call out, like the 2 bold ones is the one I was responsible for, which I think is important. But yeah, so then that little sentence here will replace this because it's saying the same thing, right? It really is saying essentially the same thing. So now you have your kickoff, two sentences, super sweet, straight to the point, and then you have your user stories, pretty much the same thing, 2 sentences, and it's straight to the point, and you're still hitting all of the important information that you want to communicate, and now you're getting rid of all of the fillers, and now you're separating them into groups that they belong in, so it's easier to follow, right? So then that's a few ways to do it. Another way to do it, and we already see a couple of examples of this, is bulletin or numbering, a way to like separate. So for example here, I mean, we all do this kind of without thinking about it because it's just kind of so obvious in our brain, right? For like here, she bulletin each like different information she wanted to share. If she were to type this out as a sentence, it would be just that much more harder to scan through it and still understand all the information. Another one is numbering, right? Instead of a whole big blurb, numbering it and separating it like this really helps with the scannability. Another way with the scannability is visuals. So what I mean by visuals, it doesn't just mean like, photographs or sometimes like imageries. It could be anything. It could be, I'm sure those who looked at like a million portfolio saw that they would put, some people would put information in like a card. So like insights, and they'll put like one card here with the first insight, second card here with the second insight, and then third card here with the third insight. And using visual things like that to separate stuff is another good way. A very small example of this is this guy's right here, right? Is using visuals to separate the different stages, right? So she could have done a bulletin of like ideation. Instead, she chose to visually put it together, as you can see here. So this is what I mean by like, it doesn't always mean like imagery or like pictures. It's just that this is it's a visual way, right? It's got shapes and it's got lines and it's got outlines and all that fun stuff. So that's what I mean by one of the visual ways. The second visual ways is more straightforward, where you can point things out instead of writing about it. So, for example, and this is pure example, I'm not saying like this is the solution for this section. For example, she wrote like, we selected 2 shades of blue as the primary colors because they stand for depth, sincerity, wisdom, and confidence. Maybe some of these points could be put on like an image, right? So there's like, maybe she can put all of like the color story, and she can point to the blue, and then she said, selected because of depth, sincerity, and blah blah blah. So again, I'm not saying that that should be done for this section. I don't think so. It was just pure example of what I mean by like, you can use like pointers and everything on the visual itself to type it out instead of putting it into a paragraph. This this is a good example of what I mean. Like, she pointed out the things that she did to hand off to the engineers. So instead of like writing these out in a paragraph, if she visually points to it and then type it out, it's just easier for us to read through it versus like a big paragraph. Another thing, it does go hand in hand with separation of information, is indenting and putting it into a separate paragraph. For example, here, because each paragraph is its kind of own has its own talking points, she indented and then started a new paragraph for this, right? So that's a great way to separate information. And then the last thing of how to make a paragraph or the copy scannable is bolding the most important things. For here, she bolded the name magnetic, but see how as you're scrolling through, our eyes automatically go to here first. Well, maybe it goes to here first and second, and then maybe this is third. But it has a higher visual hierarchy than the rest of this, simply because it's bolded and it's italicized. But yeah, utilizing the same concept to highlight the most important thing. So let's say, for example, this is a big blurb, right? But let's say there is that one sentence or maybe a couple of words that pretty much highlights what this entire sentence, what this entire paragraph is saying. Then highlighting that will make it more scannable. Because now, as I'm scrolling through, as long as I read those bold couple of words or sentences, I'm still able to follow and understand the story of how the product was created. So those are the very few things that can be used or utilized to make the page a bit more scannable and friendly. I do think utilizing some of those, it can help make some of these bigger paragraphs more scannable. Because right now, with this particular case study, unless I read all of the paragraph, I can't follow the story of how the product was created. I can understand the steps you took, like high fidelity mockups, like low fidelity, research like that. But again, like that is the design process. That's not unique to this particular product. I want to learn and I want to be able to follow the creation of this particular product, which is more than just user stories and user flows and wireframes and such. Last thing I want to talk about was the storytelling of a product in a case study. And the more case studies that I take a look at and the more that I review, the more I am forming an opinion of two things. Number one is it should be less about the sequence of the design process and more about the creation of the product itself and what went into creating the product. And I'll explain that in details in a bit. The second thing is it's not enough to just show the product. We need to be able to showcase and communicate who we are as a designer, how our brain works, what is our process, and what we do. Right? It's not enough to just show like a affinity map, let's say. Instead, we should be showing what our brain does with that affinity map. What do we find so intriguing? What do we find that's interesting? How did our brain like synthesize all of that? What are the main things that we took away? What was like the aha moments, right? It's those two things that are very important in the case study. I think the user flow here is a great example of those two that I just talked about. So in this section, you did not create the user flow. The user flow was provided by the client. But now the way this case study is laid out, it is showing me the product in the sequence of the design system. So you did, so you've got your competitive analysis, you got your red roots down, and then you have your user flows, and then you have your brainstorm and ideation and low fidelity mockup, right? Those are like, it's just you kind of following through that design process. And what I meant by earlier, it should be less about the design process and more about the creation of the product. When I say that, what I mean is, okay, here are the user flows, right? And you were provided it. But what did this user flow do? What did it provide you? What information did it provide you in order to help you design this product? What are some things that you took out of it, right? And again, this go hand in hand with the second point I was talking about, where it's showcasing who you are as a designer, right? So right now, this user flow, it means nothing to the reader, right? You didn't create it, so it does nothing for the reader. With this information, I won't be able to come up with an opinion of whether or not we are interested in you or not, because it's not your work, right? It wasn't meant to be your work. What's more important than just showcasing the user flow is to show us how did this user flow that you were provided, how did it affect the main like the end product, right? How did it help you create that product? What did you get out of it, right? Again, showing how your brain works. What are the things that you got out of it? Maybe you look through it and you're like, oh, so the flow is it can get pretty complicated, so I have to make sure my UI is like super simple. Maybe there was a moment you took a look at it and like, I don't know if that makes sense. I think there's a better way to do it. Like, did you go out to the client and be like, hey, I saw this XYZ. I think this would be a better route. Like, was there a collaboration there? Like, that type of information tells me more about you and this product than just showing me a user flow, right? And it kind of really goes back into the point that I pretty much make every time is like, really understanding the main goal of what you're trying to show. What is the intention here, right? What's the intention of showing the user flow? Was it so that the reader have a better understanding of the flow so they can understand your low fidelity? Was it to show that you have a user flow, and or was it to show that a user flow is important? Like really defining what your intention with this is can help you figure out how to lay those information out. So, for example, if your main goal was to give the reader or like the hiring manager or the recruiter to help them understand the flow of it in order to understand your low fidelity, then I would question, like, do they need to understand the user flow? Then is it necessary, right? Or if your goal is to show that there is a user flow, a question I would ask is, do they need to know that there's a user flow? Like, what did it do for the what did it do to help you create the last, your end product? If it didn't do much besides just giving you like the different screens that you needed to design for, then is it necessary to show a big user flow like this, especially 3 times? Or is it just enough to write like, oh, they gave us a user flow, right? So depending on your goal and your intention, that solution and how it's going to look like is going to be different. Another example of digging deep and improving the storytelling is, for example, here, like low fidelity mockups. You just told me that you did low fidelity mockups, but again, this doesn't tell me anything about you. Okay, you know how to do low fidelity, you know that exists. I mean, but of course, like that is, kind of like the basics of, like that's like the step by step, like basics of a design. What is it? A design process. And also, like an FYI, not every designer does. Like, you don't always need a low fidelity mockups. Depending on the product, the problem, depending on the complexity of it. Sometimes I go straight into a high fidelity, because sometimes a low fidelity would be a waste of time for me, right? It depends on a very more simple one, yes. If it's more complex and crazy, I even start with paper and pencil. It, again, doesn't tell me anything about you. Now, what will tell me about you and how you work and how you work with your team is how did you come up with these specific design decisions. So let's say this tab right here, right? Why did you guys decide that these 5 are the tabs that that is the most important navigation wise, right? Why isn't it why isn't portfolio just like a settings gear up here? Why is it important to have a portfolio here? Whatever it is. Another thing is your design decision on making these, like your top matches, the first thing that they see. Design decisions of like why showing the people around you is important. Let's move on to like this screen right here. I guess this is more of a UI thing, I guess. Your design decision of why is this a drawer, right? Instead of like a new screen or, something else. I think that will help me understand, again, the creation of the product and how it ended up here and how you work as a designer more than what it is now. Because there's a big disconnect. Okay, you went from user flow and we just jumped into a finished low fidelity mockups. And I'm sure there was so many things that happened in between those two. And I want to see what happened in between those 2 steps. That's all the things that came up in my head as I was looking through the portfolio. And really the major big thing is just digging deep into the details, explaining the why, and really furthering like the storyline, telling how the product was created, not so much about like the design process that you took to create it. But hopefully, oh, and also like little tiny last nitpick is the indentation of the bulletin. I just don't think it makes sense. It makes sense here, right? Because you have a little like sentence and a blurb, and this indentation helps me segment those two or like separate those two. But in terms of here with like just the title and these, it would, I think, look better if it's aligned. But anyway, another tiny little nitpick there. But hopefully this review helps at all. If not for you, Alexia, I hope it does help someone else who is viewing it. And again, you could always reach me out in LinkedIn and ask me questions that you have. Thank you, guys.